Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here. This is an amazing turnout. Rachel had asked me to honor Harry Adler's donation of paint to the Wedding Cake House, asked if I would be interested in giving a talk about some of the things I've found out or discovered or, that are out there about the Wedding Cake House. And she said, put on your, creative cap, and what's a good title? And I for whatever reason, the title, No Wine, Many Women, One Song, came to me like that, and hopefully you will discover as we make our way through these stories exactly what I'm talking about. So I want to thank also I want to thank the Preservation Society. I want to thank the Bell Street Chapel, this beautiful and historic space that we're allowed to give this talk in, gather here. How many people have never been in the Bell Street Chapel before? Oh, wow. So I hope you feel welcome in this beautiful, really exquisitely beautiful space. How many people have been to services at the Bell Street Chapel on Sunday? Just a few. I have come quite a few times, and it's always a really beautiful experience, meditative and calming in this chaotic world. So if you are looking for a refuge on a Sunday morning, this is a great place to come and find it. I moved to Providence about 7 years ago, and I love history. I write historical fiction. I have a degree in history, and I also just dwell in it. And stories of place are always really interesting to me. Wherever I'm at, I'm intrigued by the history that sort of is revealed in the built environment and what those stories tell us about the city. So I had done a little work, and Elizabeth Francis from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities is here. She approached me and asked me if I would be interested in doing a road tour, walking tour for the west side of Providence. Road Tour is a phone app you can get on your computer. It's RHODE, R-H-O-D-E, tour.org, and it's a great place to explore, to sort of guide you into the neighborhoods. So I had the great honor to do this road tour, walking tour. The house that Rachel mentioned, James Eddy's mansion that was in the park, there's a photo on the Road Tour app. I totally give you permission to pull out your phones and download it right now and check it out if you want to see what that house looked like. It's pretty extraordinary that, again, what I'm amazed by in walking through Providence is both the beautiful historic built environment that we all love, but continually amazed by the things that are gone. So I think that as I was digging into a little narrative around the Wedding Cake House, I got to know Pippi and Xander, and it was shortly after that that they really took on this monumental, overwhelming, incomprehensible venture to restore and preserve this really extraordinary piece of architecture and history of the city. And so I was thrilled when they asked me to be on the advisory board for this venture, and thrilled to continue to dig, to have a sense of purpose around continuing to dig into the story of this place. And so I'm thrilled tonight to share some of those stories with you. Change is constant, things are always changing. I think that as the city of Providence changes, even in the 7 years that I've been here, I've seen changes, and I think a venture like what Pippi and Xander are engaged in is really about preserving a sense of culture and community and the character of the city that we really care about. So I think that it would be great if you guys agree for you to find a way to support Pippi and Xander in this really amazing effort they're making. I have had the great privilege of carrying hundreds, if not thousands, of black plastic garbage bags full of rock debris out of the Wedding Cake House. It's an experience that you really won't regret. You can't find it anywhere else. So with that being said, I will share with you a little of some of the interesting aspects of the Wedding Cake House. I wanted to start with Anna and Laura Tirocchi. It's often known as the Tirocchi House. And I think that these sisters, these half-sisters, are some of the best known representatives of the history of the house. In 1990, RISD curators were invited by Laura Tirocchi's son, Louis Cella, to come into the house and take whatever they thought was appropriate for the museum. It was, and in the sort of narrative of this beautiful book that Rachel brought, so I mean, this is, if you haven't joined, this is well worth the price of joining the PPS. This is a book called From Paris to Providence. This was done by the RISD Museum as a companion to an exhibit of the archives that they were able to gather from the Wedding Cake House. And in this book, they talk about the curators entering this space, you know, in 1990, a space that had been in many ways shuttered at Anna Tirocchi's death in 1947. So like walking into a time capsule of a high fashion atelier right here in Providence, sort of hidden away in plain sight. The clothes, the delicate sort of clothes brought from Paris, still wrapped in tissue paper, all of the paperwork, all of the threads and needles, everything sort of neatly organized, ready to open shop. So I can only imagine what that experience was like to sort of step back in time. And so who were these women? As many of you know, Providence became a focal point of Italian immigration, and today we talk a lot, you hear on the news a lot of talk about chain migration, and the Tirocchi sisters are an example of how chain migration works. Some family members end up in a place and other family members follow them. The presence of family in a place, in a destination, helps support and give a footing to the new family members who are arriving. And that's very much the story of the Tirocchi sisters. The family was in a small town outside of Rome called Guarcino, and the first family members who came over arrived around 1902. The first brother of Anna and Laura, Salvatore Tirocchi, came here and settled in Silver Lake, what is now we call Silver Lake. Other family members followed. Laura and Anna was the older sister, so they both came over to the States around 1905. So Anna would have been 35, and Laura would have been young, maybe 14, is that right? Am I doing the math right? 14, 15 years old. So a teenage girl. The family tradition also says that these two women, Anna, their mother sent Anna with her younger sister to Rome to work as seamstresses, so in an atelier in Rome where they got some training. The family tradition also says they arrived in New York and spent a couple years there, also working as seamstresses before arriving in Providence in 1907, where they became boarders in their family's house. Their brother Salvatore and sister Eugenia, who were established here. The family was very entrepreneurial. They had many different businesses that different family members were engaged in. Anna, as you can see on this picture, this is Anna Tirocchi. This is taken in their workshop that was at the Butler Exchange, which is where the Industrial Trust building is now on Kennedy Plaza. Anna, a much older sister, obviously much more experienced, also someone with a real sense of ambition, confidence, pursuit of a goal. They worked for a few years in an East Side seamstress shop for high-end East Side clients, and so between 1907 and 1911, by 1911, Anna, taking out loans from family members, so getting that family support to start a business, was able to open up her shop in the Butler Exchange in 1911. They were there for 4 years, again, catering to a high-end sort of East Side clientele. The larger issues happening at that time, ready-to-wear is coming online, mass-produced clothing is being made, fewer and fewer seamstresses are able to find work. So it was necessary to specialize, and again, they specialized into this very elite, high-end customer. And by 1915, Anna was able on her own to buy the house, 514 Broadway. So the house in her name was purchased. In that same year, Laura married Dr. Louis Cella, who whose parents had immigrated from Italy, but he had been born here in Providence and was a prominent, well-known citizen, became active in politics after this family was established at the Wedding Cake House. The first floor, the back rooms were his doctor's office. The second floor were the parlors for this couture business that they were running. The third floor was the workshop and the living quarters for the family. So an interesting arrangement within the household after the height of this business was in the 1920s, and you can see a couple of the images. These are also on the road tour and are generously sort of granted use from the RISD Museum. So they would go to Paris, look at the collections, buy garments that were half assembled, bring them back to fit them to clients, to sew them together. So you really had you could, right here on Broadway, get a Paris original. They would also go to New York, do shopping trips there. They would advertise in the papers, just returned from New York, come see our selection of, garments. So a really interesting business to think of these East Side ladies motoring down Broadway, entering the house, taking the elevator maybe to the second floor, dwelling in these parlors. There was apparently a billiard room up front for the guys to hang out in while their ladies were getting fitted in these gowns. A lot of social scene stuff on the East Side, parties. Anna also had a reputation as a hard driving boss. I think that fits in this ambitious sort of business that she's building, but also some of the interviews with the women who worked as seamstresses in the atelier talk about her being sort of a surrogate mother as well, interested in the well-being and the future of the women who worked for her. And as you can see, this is, I don't know who, this is Anna. I suspect that's Laura Tirocchi. There are other pictures of her that are kind of grainy, and it looks similar. She's kind of positioned up front. So these two sisters, but obviously a whole maybe 12 or 15 women who are in this photo working with them over decades. You can imagine how many women, all of the majority of these women, Italian immigrant women working as seamstresses in this shop. Anna had a summer home in Narragansett Pier. She would take the seamstresses down to her house for a week or two in the summer to give them a little vacation. So clearly a little motherly kind of boss lady. Interestingly, she never married. She remained single her whole life. She began to assemble quite a bit of real estate, property on North Main, property in the neighborhood that provided her with rental income. So she had a variety of businesses, particularly as the Great Depression hit and that fashion business began to decline. She also had some illnesses that kept her bedridden, and so as she got into the 40s, there was less and less fashion work being done, and finally she died in 1947. The family remained in the house. Laura lived until 1982, and her daughter Beatrice passed away in 1990, which I believe is the trigger event for her son Louis to open up the house and look for a way to preserve this. Both the Rhode Island RISD Museum and URI have collections from the Tirocchi House. So an interesting place to look at, and certainly a large number of the many women we're going to be talking about this evening. So that, I think, is a story that's been covered a lot, and I wanted to sort of make sure that we touched on it. But there's a lot of information available. This book, From Paris to Providence, certainly can tell the story far better than I, and a lot of great details that I think you should, if you're interested, I encourage you to explore. What was interesting for me is how this house was sort of born. How did it end up in this space? Why does it look the way it looks? And who were the people who made it look that way? And so that is a much harder sort of story to uncover. This is a picture in the collection of Historic New England. This is from about the time that the house was completed. Just from sort of looking at the fashions, it's hard to see there. some ladies here in hoop skirts, but narrow hoops, so late 1860s, two men, one in a top hat, sort of seated over here. The house looks very new. I think that there's this fence is great, the trees, it must be spring. The permit to build was issued in February of 1867, so this may be the following spring, early 1868, when the family is able to move in, and they take a little family shot. And so I did a little close-up of it, and you can see, I don't know if it looks better or worse here, it's very pixelated, which I also think is a great metaphor for digging into the backgrounds of these random people. You are able to come up with little pieces of information, details that are sort of tantalizing, that give you a sense of insight, but never necessarily a full, clear picture. So one of the places I always look is census records, of course, and this is from the census of 1870, and it shows the occupants of the house at this time. John Kendrick, a reed and harness maker. His wife, it says Lorena, her name is Lorana, so some census sort of iffiness going on. Their son, Johnny Kendrick, 15 years old. A woman, Sabra Brigham, her daughter, Ethelyn Brigham. Sabra is Lorana's sister. So her sister and her niece are living in the house with them. Also, Mary McLeckerdy, a domestic from Ireland, something also very common at this time. A lot of Irish domestics in Providence, a huge amount of Irish immigration by 1870. And also, interestingly, James Powers, a gardener, born in Rhode Island. So someone I'm sure Pippi and Xander would like to have around today to help with the work. So who are these people? I don't know, we can guess. This is John Kendrick. This would be Lorana, I'm guessing, his wife. Sabra Brigham, maybe, and her daughter, Ethelyn. Who is this guy? Maybe John Kendrick's brother, Joseph Kendrick, who was a business partner of his, and so would have had an interest. We're going to take a family portrait. Come on over and hang out. Maybe the gardener. Maybe the neighbor. This guy who lives next door, on the same page right below is the family of Pardon Stone. A man who is listed here as a corset manufacturer with his wife Mary, and Mary's parents, Perez and Rebecca Mason. So I don't know if people know anything about the wedding cake house. You may have heard the architect is Perez Mason. As it turns out, he actually lived right next door, so a pretty convenient commute for that job. So John Kendrick, born in New Hampshire, 52 years old in 1870, born around 1817 on a farm in New Hampshire. He, as a teen, left home and went to apprentice in an iron foundry. So this would have been in the 1830s. There is an industrial revolution happening in New England at this time, an explosion of manufacturing driven by cotton textile production. So John Kendrick leaves his home and enters this new industrial world, becomes an apprentice. He spends a few years there in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and then ends up in Worcester, Massachusetts, where there is a burgeoning cotton industry. Textile producing industry. He ends up working in a mill shop. So he is a mechanic in the shop. All of the manufacturing, all of the making of parts for these power looms was done in-house. There was no sort of global distribution system. You didn't order parts anywhere. If it broke, you had to fix it on site. So John Kendrick became a specialist in this kind of manual work. In the narratives, the sources that tell of his life, they say in Worcester he started in a small shop and a mill with 3 female employees. So women were obviously a part of the mill working culture. It's interesting to think of them in this shop, John Kendrick and 3 women working in this shop. What he was producing were reed and harness frames on a, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So working in this shop with these 3 women, establishing a business, he sees that there is more going on in Woonsocket, where there's a big mill business, and so he decides to relocate down there to cover a little more of his life. He marries in September 1841 a woman named Louise Conant from New Hampshire, who dies 18 months later. I don't know why she died, but this kind of time lapse between the marriage and death, to me, indicates some complications from childbirth, and certainly is a reminder in this time of the high mortality rate for women due to childbirth. Within 18 months, he marries Lorana Cook, who is from a farm as well, has ended up in Worcester, and they're married there. So John Kendrick, Lorana Cook, both from farming families, moving into the city following this trend of urbanization, and John then moving to Woonsocket, where there's this big mill business. So Woonsocket in 1855 looks a little bit like this. There's a mill building in the background. There are many mills being built in Woonsocket. Starting in 1817, the falls there offered a great source of water power. Rhode Island names like Ballou and Lippet are associated with the mills of Woonsocket. So John Kendrick, seeing an opportunity, moves down here in around 1846, and he begins to function in a shop in one of these mills as well. In this mill, during this time, he also has 25 women working with him in this shop. So again, an exclusively female group of employees in this mechanic shop where they're making these reed and harness frames. Who is in Woonsocket in 1850? So checking the census there, we can see John Kendrick and Lorana. Mary Cook, her sister, is living with them. Sophie Barrett, someone else, maybe she's a young girl who works in the mill, maybe she's a domestic servant. But also nearby is Charles Brigham, who is, like John Kendrick, a harness maker. And Charles Brigham is married to Sabra Brigham, Lorana Cook's sister. So there's a family business happening here. John Kendrick, Charles Brigham, both in this harness and frame building, mechanics working in this new burgeoning industry. Who else is in the house? A lot of kids. We see Ethelyn here is just 6 months old. A guy named John Wise, who is 19, a mechanic from New Hampshire. Joseph H. Kendrick. So John Kendrick's brother is living in the household of Charles Brigham, also a mechanic, 19 years old. So again, this interesting interconnection of these families, all working class. These people are working in factories, doing hard labor, doing mechanical tasks. They're doing well. They have some assets, $2,000 for John Kendrick, $2,500 in real assets for Charles Brigham, but they're certainly not rock stars. They're certainly not the people who built the wedding cake house, not at this point. But what happens? John Kendrick, what are they working on? That's the cue. They're working on power looms. So at this time too, these mills are full of all sorts of machinery to process cotton and wool into cloth. So there are carding machines, there are spinning machines, there are spinning jennies, there are these power looms, which were invented originally in England. Little industrial espionage brought the technology to Slater Mill in the 1790s, and that is what created this huge textile mill boom in New England in the early 19th century. And so these parts, as I said, were all sort of built and repaired in the shop. You can see the warp threads. This is the cloth coming through the loom. The warp threads are on a beam, and they're rolled through, they're threaded through a reed, which is like a grill. So the reed keeps the threads separate and even, so that you have this even cloth that gets produced through this mechanical process. The harness is like a heddle for the weavers out there. So the harness operates in alternating threads, opening them up so the shuttle passes through, closing them, the shuttle passes through. So this harness is creating this up and down motion that allows the shuttle to automatically pop back and forth through. This is an example of a shuttle that would move back and forth across this machine, these gears raising and lowering that harness. So John Kendrick, working in these shops of these mills, each mill repairing its own reeds, building its own harnesses, building all this mechanism, surrounded by all these other people who are working in the same thing. Anyone who, today we talk about innovation and labs and all this collaborative venture that's happening in problem solving, John Kendrick is able to sort of capture this idea to create a uniform, standardized set of reeds and harnesses that can be mass-produced by machines and marketed to all of these mills. Within 2 years, all the mills in Woonsocket are buying standard form reeds and harnesses from John Kendrick. 1851, he decides. Another note about Woonsocket, mid-century, some of the sources talk about Woonsocket. The mills in Woonsocket were dominated by Providence capitalists at this time. So interesting to think, from the farms to Worcester to Woonsocket, ultimately to Providence, the big industrial city that's exploding at this time, drawing people in. The money, the capital is in Providence, the capital that's being spread out to these different mill ventures all over Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts. John Kendrick is going to the heart of the machine and establishing his industrial works to capture this textile market and make a fortune. Who were the other people working in these mills? Of course, it was a lot of women. So this is an advertisement from Annette and Seine Machine Work, but it's so ubiquitous in the advertisement they show a woman standing before that weaving machine. This is another later image. This is a young woman at Lorraine Mills in Pawtucket. This is a photograph taken by Louis Wicks Hine in 1909. What she's doing is taking those threads from this warp beam and threading them through the harness and the reeds. So this elaborate process, very specific of aligning these threads through this machine before that industrial process begins, and that thread can be turned into cloth. All right, moving right along. So John Kendrick and his family moved to Providence in 1851. A little context for Providence, 1830, the population is almost 17,000 people. 1850, 42,000. So in 20 years, 2.5 times the size of 1830. 1865, about 55,000, 3.2 times. 1875, over 100,000 people. So in 45 years, multiplying by 6, the population has this six-fold increase. So a pretty extraordinary population increase driven by domestic immigration, so people coming from Rhode Island, from all over the country, into Providence seeking opportunity, driven also by immigration from other countries, and in particular at this time, Ireland. In 1855, about 48,000 people in Providence, 13,000 of them are of foreign birth. 10,500 of those of foreign birth are Irish. Including the children of Irish parents, 40% of those 48,000 people are Irish. Irish-born or born of Irish parents who immigrated into the city. So an extraordinary amount of immigration coming in and transforming the aspect of the city. This is the city John Kendrick and Lorana Kendrick are entering. Providence manufactures in 1855. So what the city created in manufactures, 17.5 million, almost 5 million of that are textile-related industries. So the textile industry in Providence is huge, not accounting for outside of Providence where the vast majority of the mills are. In 1855, the value of reed and harness manufacturers, 60,000. That's pretty much John Kendrick. By 1865, 80,000. 1875, 150,000. The value of the goods produced in that year. So each year, that value of goods being produced going up and down with the economy, but obviously a pretty dramatic increase over time as well. Also interesting to think about, in 1865, in the state of Rhode Island, 23,327 men were employed in textile-related industries in the state. 49% of all, that should say, all men employed in manufacturing in Rhode Island. So 50% of the men employed in manufacturing are employed in the textile business. Of the women, almost 12,000 or over 12,000 women employed in the textile industry. That represents 83% of all the women employed in manufacturing in the state of Rhode Island. So a real significant sort of gender imbalance there. The vast majority of places that women could find jobs in manufacturing were in the textile industry, either as mill workers, but interesting to note that in 1865, John Kendrick employed, or the reed and harness manufacturers of Providence employed 67 men men and 26 women. So women remained an important component of this, this business. Also, not solely in Providence, I think what makes this city interesting as well in terms of this narrative, not just in these industrial mechanical jobs, not just in monitoring mill machines, but bookkeepers. Both John Kendrick and his neighbor Pardon Stone employed female bookkeepers. So a real administrative class, professional class of women developing in Providence as well, which I think is an interesting narrative around the life of the city. John and Lorana Kendrick were acquiring great wealth very quickly through the 1850s. They also extended their social and professional networks through the city. So John Kendrick, first when John Kendrick arrived, he set up business at 14 Exchange Place. This is a billhead that shows Exchange Place, a little bit of Exchange Place in that building where what became the American Supply Company was established. Through different mergers, by 1883, John Kendrick had become the leading global supplier in reed and harness frames and had organized his company under the name of the American Supply Company. So this is around the time of, this is probably 1880s, maybe 1870s, Exchange Place, but down right here is that number 14 Exchange Place. You can see the old Union Station, the Butler Exchange, where the Industrial Trust is now, which is where decades later Anna and Laura Tirocchi would set up their business. So John Kendrick just down the street from them. As the business grew, by 1867, he built a manufacturing building, a factory for the work. This was at Clifford and Eddy Street. So today, if you go down Dorrance Street and past the Garrahy Judicial Complex, Clifford Street is next. This building, a parking lot now, is where that factory was, built there in 1867. John Kendrick also entered politics. He was in the Republican Party. He became a member of the City Council in 1865. He was a founding member of the YMCA in 1853. Providence was the second city in America to establish a YMCA, and John Kendrick, again, interested in the moral life of the city, was a part of that. Lorana, too, was very active in these civic causes, membership in the Women's Christian Association, which, like the YMCA, had a home for single women in the city. So a desire to provide a space for women to be protected from the predatory and dangerous influences of city life. Also, the Children's Friends Society. Someone here may be applying for a job to the Children's Friends Society. Interesting to know, Lorana Kendrick was one of the donors and active participants in that. The Women's City Missionary Society, the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, doing things to raise money for the Slocum Light Guard. So after the Civil War, continuing to memorialize this war experience that was so important to all of the people who experienced that. Their brother, John Kendrick's brother, Joseph Kendrick, served in the war for 3 years. So a direct and personal connection to that experience. A founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Lorana Cook, as well. The family abstained from alcohol, another of those evils of urban life that people needed to be protected from. So no wine. She continued through her life also to be a member of a variety of women's clubs. And what I'm getting to now, but all of this is connected to this religious life of the city, which was such a crucial factor in both the way people understood their place in the world and the way they connected and related to other people through the church. John and Lorana Cook and their family were Methodists. They arrived in Providence in 1851 and immediately became members of the Mathewson Street Methodist Church. So this is an image of Mathewson Street from maybe 1870. You can see, so this is Grace Church. This is Westminster Street is down there. This is what was the Westminster Congregational Church, but had its front lopped off and a theater put on in front. So, and that theater facade is still there. And on the left, you can see the spire of this church, the first Mathewson Street Methodist Church built in 1851. So the church that John and Lorana Kendrick would have known when they arrived in the city. Newly built, the congregation was very proud of it. They said it was the finest church building in the city at the time. A nice interior shot. Many thanks, as always, for everything to the Providence Public Library for facilitating, for preserving all of this and making it accessible to people to share with all of you. So an interesting part of that life, Mathewson Street, Exchange Place, Clifford and Eddy, all of these different charitable organizations. My phone is buzzing telling me it's been a little bit of time, so we'll motor through the rest. Who else was a member of the church? As it turns out, Pardon Stone and his wife Mary and Perez and Rebecca Mason were members, devoted long-term members of the Mathewson Street Methodist Church. John Kendrick and Pardon Stone were stewards of the church. They also were on the board of the East Greenwich Methodist Seminary together, and they also participated in an annual event that took place in Martha's Vineyard, a religious gathering of Methodists and other denominations at the Wesleyan Grove, what later became Oak Bluffs. Have people been to Cottage City on Martha's Vineyard? How many people have sort of seen it? A lot of people. So when you look at the Wedding Cake House, think of John Kendrick and his wife, their family, of Pardon Stone and his wife and her parents, all traveling down to Cottage City together. Here's a quick, so who were Perez and Rebecca Mason, Pardon and Mary Stone? This is from the Providence Journal. This is Pardon Stone and Mary Stone in 1847 when they were married. 50 years later, they had their 50th wedding anniversary, so they got a little feature in the paper. This was their house, which was next door to the Wedding Cake House. So when you go out later, you'll see the Wedding Cake House, and look to the right, you'll see St. Mary's Church, the great stone Gothic church. That red brick building on the corner is on the site of Perez Mason and Pardon Stone and their family's home. So this is an image of that home from the St. Mary's Church. It was turned into a convent after it was sold, and in the 19-teens, the house was torn down and a new convent building was put up. But, this was the family home. Perez Mason was an architect and builder. He got his start in Fall River in the 1840. He apprenticed in Providence, went back to Fall River. In 1843, there was a great fire. He got a lot of business, a lot of jobs rebuilding that city. By the early 1850s, after his daughter Mary has married Pardon Stone, they have all relocated to Providence. Pardon Stone was born in Connecticut. Again, another farm boy who comes to Providence and apprentices in the jewelry industry, and he starts his own jewelry company in the 1840s. Stone and Weaver. He is able to acquire a fortune, buy this property at the end of Broadway, which in the 1850s is really newly opened. So at the far end of this new avenue where all these fancy homes are being built. And I am guessing that Perez Mason is responsible for this house. We don't really know. What are the other works that Perez Mason has done? The Methodist Church in Warren, so a really classical sort of New England church style. This is the Fearing Mansion, which was in Cathedral Square. Don't mind the elephants, but you can see this heavily bracketed, sort of this ornate sort of style. So maybe a little echo of the Wedding Cake House. This is a house on Sutton Street that was purchased. The lot was purchased by Perez Mason for his son William H. Mason, and the house was built there a year later. Presumably, Perez Mason may have had something to do with that. So a sample of the work that doesn't necessarily give us an indication of why the Wedding Cake House looks the way it does. But I think for me, what is interesting is to return to Cottage City and think about the life that these people led on their summer vacations there in the Wesleyan Grove. The first camp meeting started there in 1835. This is 1887, so you can see it really built up. A lot of these wood cottages have been built. There's a big tabernacle in the middle, but in its starting in the 1830s, this is the Second Great Awakening, so a huge religious movement in the Northeast. people begin gathering. This becomes a summer resort and a religious retreat for people every summer to go to this location on Martha's Vineyard right by the ocean side. Here, this is from Harper's in 1868, showing people traveling on a ferry from New Bedford, or you can get your own boat, take a nice boat ride out there, some people bathing, all of the entertainments available. This is the Tabernacle, the preacher's stand. This was designed and built by Perez Mason. Again, the Pardon Stone, Perez Mason, all of these people would gather in this spot. This was a spot of exchange too. Perez Mason ended up building a lot of churches. These interactions with the community from all over Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, who gathered here, certainly offered both this religious climate, but also an opportunity for networking, for connections, for other work. What else did What else was life like at this Wesleyan Grove? Tents. From the 1830s into the 1850s, people would come and stay in tents. It had this informal feeling to it. You can see the woman cooking at her stove in the back of the tent. Some of the observers said you could just walk around these avenues and look in the tents and see, women working in their kitchen, something you wouldn't normally see on the street. So this sense of familiarity. And by the 1850s, some of these little wooden cottages being designed. So a little Gothic revival thing, Andrew Jackson Downing-ish sort of Gothic cottage that Perez Mason also played a part in expanding the style. In the Wesleyan Grove, he built what is reputed to be the first artful cottage. So taking this Gothic style, expanding it with all these sort of elaborate embellishments, the gingerbread and the tower turrets and the arched windows. And here, I hope that they are visible. They sort of show up well. A couple stereo views from the New York Public Library that show some of these cottages. So you can see some of the detail here, the balustrade and this sort of pendant cornice, very similar to what we see on the Wedding Cake House. Some of these treatments as well, the windows, the symmetry of it, the towers. Some of Perez Mason's second home had a tower attached to it. Surely John Kendrick and his family had a home of some kind. It would be interesting to do a little more exploring down there and see. But I can also see from the 1850s these families being connected in business. Pardon Stone had his corset manufacturing in that building where the American Supply Company did their business. They were on the boards. They were on the board of treasurers for Wesleyan Grove together. This close family friendship. Perez Mason, John Kendrick bought the lot that the Wedding Cake House is built on from Perez Mason in 1865. He filed for the papers to build in 1867. I can also see him saying to Perez Mason, I want a house that looks like the cottages that we spend our summers in at the Wesleyan Grove. There's such a direct and strong connection between that architecture, that place, and the life that these people led there that I think gives some character to the house and how it looks today. And you can see right up here, there's the same details on the side of the house too. So a lot of those details that were common, a part of that vocabulary of the Gothic cottages of Wesleyan Grove transferred to the Wedding Cake House today. So that, I think, gives you a sense of who these people were. And I want to now offer a song to everyone. We're getting close. In 1870, so the house was very new, there was a party, and now you can envision these people, John and Lorana Kendrick, growing up on farms, coming up through this industrial manufacturing world, and suddenly being surrounded by the most spectacular wealth. Their neighbors, Pardon and Mary Stone, Perez and Rebecca Mason, I'm sure they were all at the house for this party that was talked about in the Providence Journal. It occurred on March 18th. When John Kendrick died, died in 1890, his obituary said that the house, the wedding cake house, they didn't refer to it as the wedding cake house, but they said John Kendrick's house was known as a minister's hotel. So the devotion to religion, to the sense of moral reform, the possibility of reshaping the world in this ideal, and his really material support of that, and generosity, his personal hospitality of opening his home to these people. A pleasant surprise with a presiding elder in it. The elegant residence of John Kendrick, 248 Broadway, was visited last evening by 150 invited guests who assembled to pay their respects to Reverend Samuel C. Brown, whose term of service as presiding elder of the Providence District expires with this session. A large proportion of the guests were clergymen and their wives, and several of the most prominent laymen of Providence, Warren, Bristol, and Fall River. So not just Providence, but a chain of cities connected both through these religious communities and in their vacation spot, their businesses. At 9 o'clock, Reverend L.B. Bates called the house to order when Mr. Kendrick read a neat address to Brother Brown and accompanied it with the gift of a beautiful silver-plated coffee urn and salver as a present from some of the laymen of the district. Dr. Brown was perfectly surprised and was speechless. Reverend E.L. Winslow and Gilbert Haven were called out, and the audience enjoyed a rich fun of humor and mirth. I can imagine. A fine collation was served, and the hours passed pleasantly away without the aid of wine. Reverend C.C. McCabe of Philadelphia sung several songs, and by request, the Trundle Bed. Many wet eyes attested the power of the sentiment and the song. Very many will remember the occasion as one of the most interesting of their lives. So in an effort to bring a little bit of that 1870 magic and make this too one of the most interesting nights of your lives, we're going to perform a little song, and we encourage you to join in. Once you get the hang of it, we've got the words. Please don't leave us hanging. Feel free to sing along. Let me have some water first. I'm all talked out. I want to thank Joe DeGeorge, everybody. Do people know Joe DeGeorge? Who knows Joe DeGeorge? Do people know Harry and the Potters? Do people know Harry and the Potters? A shout out to Harry and the Potters, an amazing, talk about culture, the elevation of culture. Joe has been an amazing sport in his willingness to do this.
I'll do the intro.
Yes.
As I rummaged through the attic, listening to the falling rain, as it pattered on the shingles and against the window pane, peeping over chests and boxes, which with dust were thickly spread, saw I in the farthest corner what was once my trundle bed. Now you know the tune. As I listened, recollections that I thought had been forgot came with all the gush of memory rushing, thronging to the spot. Very good. And I wandered back to childhood, to those very days of yore, when I knelt beside my mother by this bed upon the floor. Here we are. So I drew it from the recess where it had remained so hearing all the while the music of my mother's voice in song, as she sang in sweetest accents what I since have often read. A little slower. Hush, my dear, lie still and slumber. Holy angels guard thy bed. Not yet. Hold on, there's more. One more. Wait, there's more. Years have passed, and that dear mother long has moldered in the sun, and I trust her sainted spirit revels in the home of God. But that seen as summer twilight never will from memory fled. And it comes in all its freshness when I see my trundle bed. Then it was with hands so gently placed upon my infant head that she taught my lips to utter carefully the words she said. Never can they be forgotten, deep and vague in memory riven. Hallowed be thy name, O Father, Father, thou who art in heaven. One more. This she taught me, then she told me of its import great and deep, after which I learned to utter, now I lay me down to sleep. Then it was with hands uplifted and in accents soft and mild that my mother asked our Father, Father, do thou bless my child.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you guys. Thank you guys for doing the whole thing. Thank you for doing the whole thing. I am happy to answer questions, but I'm going to release everyone to the refreshments downstairs, and we can chat there. Pippi and Xander, is this correct? Have opened the house. Is this correct? They will go and open the house so you guys can take a look and imagine yourselves. Think of the Trundlebed song. No wine, no wine, no wine. Thank you all very much.